Yo, what's going on, guys? Schmeck here. Today I kind of wanted to make a video about some PvE basics, help you guys understand how to min-max your damage. Um, Probably the first biggest thing I saw is that a lot of people are commenting, about builds and what build you can use to kind of maximize your damage or pump the hardest, right? So I kind of, after pugging a little bit this week and kind of figuring out, what people know about the game, what meta people are using in public groups. I think it's going to be very important that we go over a lot of basics that I think require a lot more than just good builds, because it's not just about yourself in PvE, it's also about your group and how the composition fits together so that everybody can play off of each other to min-max as much damage as possible. So without further ado, let's get into it, and I'll do a little bit of an introduction here. Again, my name is Schmeck. I've been speedrunning kind of almost everything and anything PvE in this game for the last year and a half or so. The group that I run with and myself currently have multiple world records for speed and score runs. I'm a tank main, but I've also played almost every other role at a high level. And I like to think I have a good understanding of the game sometimes. So I appreciate you guys stopping by and watching the video. And I stream almost every day at Twitch. I'll drop the link here, and you guys can check it out when you get a chance. So without further ado, let's get right into it. All right, so first thing we're going to cover today is some different resources that you guys can utilize just to further your understanding of the game and kind of get an idea of where you can actually check information out at. So I got three big ones for you guys today. The first one we're going to start with is called New World Database. This is a website that just has a ton of information about the game, where you can find everything, and it also helps you look at different weapons and items and perks that you might want. So, a good example is you can check all these things out. Let's say you want like an amulet with flame protection, right? You can just come in here, figure it out, figure out the gear score it drops at. If we click it here, you can actually figure out where it's dropped and who it's dropped by, or how to obtain it. So super good resource if you need it. It's also a skill builder. You can kind of mess around with building skills for your trees. And then we can also do stuff like, let's say you're looking for a weaponsmith hat. Or we'll even do the armorer's hat, because I know that you can find these. You can kind of look up anything you want, and boom, figure out where it drops. If we click on the mob, you can even figure out the location of the mob. So, really good resource for everyone and anyone to use kind of at any given time. Now, the next one is going to be, it's called New World Buddy, and New World Buddy is freaking awesome. If we go over here to the person, you can go over to gear sets, and then you can actually make entire gear sets and kind of theory craft what you would run for your build. So here's kind of an example, right, of just something that I've done. Bada boom, bada bing. Pretty neat. And this might give you an idea of what you should shoot for. And you can kind of craft your own builds in here, or you can show people what builds you're running. Now, the biggest thing that New World Buddy is going to be used for, and let's just specifically stick to the Hive Gorgons raid right now, but this does apply to pretty much all content in the game, right? So if we go over here to these coins, and then we go down to game mode, we can go over to raids, and we can go right to Hive Gorgons, okay? Now, if we do this, we can go to all the different bosses, and we can see what they're weak to. This means what they'll take more damage to. We can see what type of attacks they do. So this is like how much damage they do and the damage type. Knowing the damage type will be really important, so you know how to gem appropriately. And you can do the same thing for pretty much all the creatures in this entire dungeon. So New World Buddy is freaking awesome because this allows you to min-max, right? If you're thinking about like how you can do the most damage, these are the things that you can start thinking about so that you can be the most protected and do the most damage. And again, the cool thing too is, this works for literally all M3s as well. So if we go to Laz, right, you can kind of see everything, all the information. You can see the attacks they do so that you can gem appropriately. New World Buddy is awesome. This is kind of one of the best ways to dive a little deeper into the game. The other thing that you can do is you can actually look up status effects of perks. So let's say I go here to like Sundering Shockwave, right? And now we're going to kind of get a little deeper into it, but you can actually have a deeper understanding of, you know, how it works, the exact decimal point of Rend that it does, all this good stuff, you know? And you can really look up all the different debuffs and buffs in this game so that you can have a better understanding of what you're applying to yourself or what you're applying to a boss. So if you like are seeing these debuffs right on your hotbar in game, you know, for example, like let's say I'm doing this, you know, I can just hover over this, and you can do this with a lot of different buffs and debuffs that you might acquire. And then you can see exactly what this is, right? And if you get more information on this, then you can understand more about the game. The last website, and again, I'm going to be linking all of these in the description, and I'll probably have a pop-up for everything. But this is a spreadsheet made by Mr. Mojito. And we're going to give him his props up here. But there is a ton of information, and we're going to come back to this a little bit later about empowers, different fortifies, how you can apply weaken, and we can really, like, you know, if you go to Rapier, you can see, oh, omnidirectional evade, 11% empower for 2 seconds. Leadership, 10% empower permanently, right? There's all this information here that you guys can utilize to, like, fully min-max your builds, basically. There's Rend, so you can have a bunch of understanding. And we're going to kind of cross the realm of, we're going to cross this bridge of weaken and Rends here in just a second, okay? So don't worry about it. So these are the resources, guys. Again, all links to these are going to be in the bio down below. So check it out if you get the chance. And we'll move over into buffs and debuffs right now. Alrighty, so we got 3 major buffs / debuffs that we're going to cover today. The first one is going to be Rend. Then we're going to cover Empower, and then we're going to cover Weaken. So the first one we're going to start with today is Rend. And what Rend does, if we look at the perforate description I have up on screen right now, is in short, like the game tells us, it decreases the target's armor. Now, decreasing armor of a mob, in this case if we talk about Hive Gorgons like Echidna, the first boss, the more Rend we do to this guy, the more damage we're going to do. By decreasing their armor, our numbers will now be higher. So let's kind of deep dive a little bit into what this means. So to break it down in more detail, mobs generally in this game, any mob you encounter in PvE is going to have a Rend cap of 70%, like we can see on screen here. However, some mobs have something called a Rend resilience. When a mob has Rend resilience, this means if their Rend resilience is 50, they will take 50% less Rend from any source that you apply. So now, essentially what's happening is our normal Rend cap of 70% is going to be multiplied by 2, because the Rend we apply is essentially halved, meaning that our current Rend cap is now 140%. Now, we can see these debuffs on Echidna when we look in New World Buddy. So like I said, New World Buddy is incredibly helpful. So now that we know our Rend cap is 140%, the general concept we should be thinking of is, how do we apply 140% Rend to a mob in order to do the most damage that we can, right? And this is just going to be one factor of the equation. So this is where, like I said before with Mojito's website, there is a ton of useful information on his website so that we can actually see all the sources of Rend that this game has. And by doing so, you'll be able to decide how you can best apply Rend to do the most Rend possible, or up to 140%, so that you can do the most damage possible. All right, so now that we've covered Rend, we are going to go into Empower. And again, just quick recap on Rend, right? Rend is one part of the equation, which is reducing the target's armor so that we can do more damage. Now we're going to go into Empower. And what Empower does is it allows you as the individual to do more damage. So if we take a look at our Skewer Spear, for example here, as we go down the passives, we can see that we gain Empower. And you can gain empower multiple ways in this game. One of the big ones is a constant empower. So I'm going to kind of bring up an empowered basics on screen right now. And there's a few things we're going to be looking at. So the first thing to note is that empower cap is 50%. This means that if we can get everybody in the group to a 50% empower, as well as applying that 140% rend that I mentioned earlier, this is going to be one of the best ways to min-max your damage as a group. Another big thing is the empowered on amulet perk. If you have empowered on amulet, any of your timed empowers will be increased by a 34% duration increase, which is massive. Before we go into the constants, which is going to be more meta, I'm also going to mention conditional empower. So conditional power, of course, is going to be anything that the user applies to themselves that is timed. This would be like the skewer that we just brought up from Spear. And the other two that you'll normally see in a group is empowering toast, which is an earring perk. And the next one is the Firestorm Heart Rune. So these will not have 100% uptime. However, they can be used to kind of keep everybody capped off on that 50% empower. Now let's go into the constant. And this is what you will see basically in every group that kind of runs seriously or has a preformed group. And this is really the way that we're able to do as much damage as we're doing. So again, we want to keep empower at 50%. Let's go over how to do that. So some of these constants are going to be Honing Stone, Leadership, Oblivion, and Ring Damage. Now ring damage, like I'll have a pop up on screen right here, is something, you could use. Thrust damage is one of the most common ones. And this just means that your damage actually counts in the empower equation. And leadership is going to be your sword and shield, a left side capstone that allows you to give your group 10% empower, which is massive. Just a little bit of a note here. This doesn't actually apply to everybody in a raid. So if we're talking about Hive of Gorgons, for example, you have a raid, but then you have two groups within that raid. So sword and shield leadership empower will only apply to the group that you're actually in and not the group that you're not in. So this is why for a lot of what we're doing right now, we're using two sword and shields, but we'll get into that later. Now the next one is Oblivion. And I cannot stress this enough. This is one of the reasons why Void Gauntlet and Void Blading is an S tier, the #1 priority weapon for any group that really wants to do well, succeed, min-max your damage, all that stuff, because you're applying 15% to everybody in the group. 15% empower is massive. So once we have all these things constant, you're going to see that we actually have an empower cap, a standard empower of 39.1%. This should kind of be the minimum expected empower for everybody in the group. Now again, empower cap's only 50%, right? So how do we get that other 20? Or that other 10.9, sorry. So let's go into that for each build, right? Now, I'm not really going to go into off-meta builds. I'm only going to be mentioning the builds that we're currently running, and I think that everybody should be using to actually min-max your damage. And that will be the Spear, Void Gauntlet, Rapier, Sword Shield, and a Rend Bot, which we will talk about in a little bit. Now, Spear, if we have that 39.1% constant, all we have to do is Skewer. If Skewer crits, we're getting a 100% uptime on max empower. It's that simple. Void Gauntlet has empowering proximity, making it very easy to get 50% empower. Sword and Shield has a heavy attack to get 30% empower for empower cap pretty easily. And then you also have the Rend Bot, which is a hammer player, and again, I'm going to go over that in a bit. Now, the big asterisk here is on your Rapier player. Rapiers are essentially empower starved. With the current meta, a Rapier doesn't have any real source of empower besides omnidirectional evade, which I'll include here. Now, you're normally just going to stack Rapiers for DPS, meaning that every decent raid group will probably have 4 to 5 Rapier players as their DPS. And again, we're going to go into these meta builds in a bit, right? But the big thing is that as a Rapier player, you need to be using omnidirectional evade on your armor in order to get up to 50.1% empower. And this will cap you at 50%. So after this, I'm going to kind of go into all this in more detail, and I'll probably touch on it again in a separate section, because I'm going to do a separate section for spear, VG, rapier, sword, shield. I'm going to do all that in this video. So stay tuned. If you guys want to check that out, you can just skip right to it now. If not, we will go into weaken real quick, and I'll see you guys over there. All right, so next up on the list is weaken. So in short, what weaken does is it reduces a mob or boss's damage whenever you hit that mob or boss with weaken. So for example, if we take a look at our spear here, you can see that our skewer hits apply weaken, reducing the target's damage by 47% for 8 seconds. So this is kind of your basic example of how weaken works exactly. So now at this point, let's go into a little bit more detail with the Hive bosses that you guys will be facing. And I'll bring this up on screen here right now. But just like we talked about with our resilience cap earlier, bosses and mobs in this game also have a weaken cap. Now, the standard weaken cap you're always gonna see is 50%. However, just like with our Rend resilience that Echidna had, they are also buffed with a weaken resilience, and their weaken resilience is 66. This means that any weaken we do will essentially be cut in third to the boss. So, just like we did with our Rend calculation, if the normal weaken cap is 50%, and the weaken that we do will be cut in third upon application, this means we will need to apply 3 times the amount of weaken as normal to hit weaken cap. And just like we see on here for our boss weaken cap, that weaken cap is going to be 150%. Now, why is weaken important? Well, in a nutshell, the more damage you take in this game means that you might need to do things like spec more con. Maybe instead of light armor, go medium armor. Maybe you need to gem differently, right? But if you can actually apply maximum weaken and hit your weaken cap, this will allow you to do things like actually run lower con, because you can take more damage on hit, because when a boss hits you, they won't do as much damage as you're used to seeing. So weaken is very important. And it's kind of, once we've done this Rend and Empower thing, now we should be talking about weaken as the final kind of part in the calculation for how we can min-max our damage. So basically, right, in a nutshell, if a boss or mob does less damage to you, this means that you can do more damage by speccing less con and putting more attributes into things like strength, dex, int, whatever type of build you decide to run, right? Again, right, guys, go check out Mojito's website. You know, I'll just bring it up again on screen right here. But if you go to his website right here, right, we can literally look at weaken, and you can see everything in the game that does weaken. There'll probably be like a few things that could be added, but it's very important that you also kind of check your comp to make sure that you actually have as much weaken as possible. So there's a few things, right? Like, actually, I'll save this for later. So we'll just probably go into the builds now, and I'll go over some meta builds, and then we'll go into some actual raid comps. Ooh-wee. All right. Woo. Just getting a little sidetracked there. So we went and hit the G Fuel. We're getting refocused up. Can you hear it swirling? Let's go. All right. So let's get into meta build number 1. Now, meta build number 1 is going to be your spear build. What I mean by meta is that this is a mandatory build for every single raid or any PvE content that you do with a group. If we look at spear real quick, it has weaken and it has rend. I'll include both of these things on the screen. And just to show you guys, right, we're going to get weaken, empower from our skewer, from that enfeebling skewer that you guys saw earlier. And then we also get rend from our perforate, which is massive. So the reason that this is important is because we are going to acquire almost 50% of the weaken needed for bosses from only one build. And spear at the same time is also pretty decent DPS. So let's go over kind of a basic spear build, right? You guys don't need to be 725, but there are a few things you're going to want to prioritize. And this is kind of a basic armor piece example of the perks you should be prioritizing. So perk number 1 is Enchanted Ward. Enchanted Ward works for almost everything in PvE. This means any damage you take you'll basically get, more or less, a direct damage reduction simply by using Enchanted Ward. Now, the next 3 perks you're going to want to prioritize are Refreshing, Health, and Weapon perks. Refreshing is going to be massive. You're always going to want to rock 4 Refreshing with pretty much every single build in PvE. And then after that, you're going to want to do Weapon perks, and then you're going to want to do Health. So we'll just go through it real quick. As you guys can see, I got Bleeding Sweep, Fortifying Perforate right here. Empowered on Amulet, plus a protection that you need is going to be really important. You're going to want Thrust Damage on Ring, which we talked about in our Empower section earlier to help you min-max your Empower uptime and your overall damage. And then we're using Empowering Toast to make sure we're staying capped at all moments. Very important. Now, we're going to touch on Finisher just very generally here, but there's a few key things I want to mention, right? So let's read Finisher Harmony for a second. Attacks against bleeding targets deal 15% more damage, and this works on both weapons. This means that if I use Finisher, but I never actually swap to my Rapier and just stay on Spear the entire time, I will be getting plus 15% damage, more or less, after it goes through the calculation, on my Spear. And this is really important, right? Because if you're a Spear, you want to be staying on Spear. You do not want to be swapping to Rapier. So I only have Finisher for the bonus damage on Spear. Some of the other options that you can rock right now are this new Fire Staff called Inferno, which, if we read it, plus 15% damage when you hit a target within 15 meters. So you have some options, right? But for bosses, just use anything that will give your main hand Spear more damage. That should be the goal. Another option is Pestilence as well. While it doesn't actually increase the damage that you do get dots. And those dots are very equivalent. So those are kind of the 3 main offhands you want to be using. So again, right, I'm never actually swapping to my Rapier to do damage. I'm only staying on my Spear. This just gives you a free damage buff. Now let's talk about Spears for a second. Number 1 perk you're always going to want is Enfeebling Skewer. You have some other options after that, and these should be kind of damage con or utility perks, but Vicious is a great option for general play. The other option is a new perk called Disdained Infliction, which could actually be really good, but there hasn't been a ton of testing around it right now. But if you wanted to rock Disdained Infliction instead of Vicious, I think that's 100% viable. Go for it. It has a high chance of even being better than Vicious is right now. After that, for third perk, you don't have a ton of great options. You could use Attunement, you could use Keenly Jagged. I have a few other options for you here. You could use Refreshing Move if you need more utility uptime from your abilities. You could use Keenly Empowered. But again, third perk is very min-max for Spear. Don't overthink it too much. Now, let's go into our skill trees. So this is a very standard skill tree for any sweep Spear in the game. You never need to be using Deep Wound because you should be having this bleed uptime at almost 100%. And then on this left side, you'll see that I'm taking Invigorating Crits, but this passive actually for stamina regen, you can really choose between maneuvers or defensive stance. Merciless Strengths will give you more damage uptime on knockdown targets. And then every time you coup de grace, you'll actually get CDR as well. I'm also going to have 2 other builds or skill trees posted right here. So the first one we're going to do is going to be our permanent Cyclone build. You can rock your Leeching Cyclone on your boots, which is really good. It's a little bit more new player friendly. You'll be able to self-sustain quite well, and Cyclone also gives you grit. But the Leeching Cyclone health back is really, really good. It'll save your life quite a bit. The other option I'm going to put out there is a third skill tree, which is a 4 skill tree. So you'll see that we have Sweep and Cyclone applied. This means that you can basically hot swap during the raid. So if you think that Sweep is better for the regular parts of the raid because you can knock down the Corvids and the other mobs, but then maybe you want Cyclone for bosses, right? And this allows you to kind of make that change mid-run, which is really good. So again, I'll just show off, last thing we're going to show off here, I think we've gone over everything, is I have a pair of Leeching Cyclone boots. So whenever I don't want to use Sweep, I can use my boots instead, and I will get a ton of health back. And then for weapon combo, right, You know, Skewer to get your Empower and weaken the target. Perforate to get your Fortify from fortifying Perforate, as well as Rend and weaken the mobs. And then really it's just rinse and repeat, right? You can throw some dodges in there if you'd like, because it gives you extra CDR. But besides that, just pump and be happy with the fact that you're doing a ton of debuffs as well as damage to the boss. All right, I realized I actually missed 2 things to go over for Spear. First one is just attributes, and then there's also some tech if you ever rock 2 spears. So this is kind of like the standard attribute setup that you would rock as a spear player. The reason that we do strength over dex is because of this guy right here. Basically, we're going to get a base damage increase to abilities and the final attack in the melee light chain. And because spear is so ability focused, and you only have 2 light attacks, using 350 strength is actually going to give you more damage overall versus running 350 dex. So this right here, what you're seeing is kind of your standard setup for spear. However, there currently is a case to be made in the Hive of Gorgons where a lot of the bosses have really bad back hitboxes, and anytime that you run into a mob or a boss that doesn't actually have a hitbox for the back, meaning that it's not possible to crit every single attack, it's actually better to run 350 dex, simply because you will have more crit uptime, which is going to be massive for your skewer critting, because you're going to want your skewer to crit in order to get that 20% empower to keep you empower capped. But also just doing more crits in general will mean doing more damage overall. So while I had the other attribute set up, here is another option that you guys can run. And I'm going to make this one a little bit more new player friendly, running with the Attuned Leather Pants. And I know a lot of you guys are running 50 con right now. I think eventually you should run the initial setup with attributes that I had, but you can always spec a little bit more con if needed. Personally, I think that 50 con is a great threshold for newer players to use so that they can actually learn and understand mechanics. And honestly, it's not going to be that massive of a DPS difference, especially for Spear. So here is kind of a perfect example of all of you guys that are kind of new to the game. If you want to run a stats setup, you'll basically run 350 dex, 25 int, 25 focus, 50 con, and then run 200 strength. And then if you have any other extra stat points, just put them in strength. The 50 con is great for extra physical armor, and while this isn't recommended at the highest level, while you should always be 5 con if you really want to go fast, this will kind of be your baseline. And if you're dying while using 50 con, that normally means that you're starting to learn mechanics, and maybe that's something that you just shouldn't get hit by, right? I don't really want to stress that the answer is more con. However, again, if you're learning, 50 con is a great start point. Now, the only other thing with Spear that I realized is that here's kind of your main Spear tree, right? And again, right, you can really, this is preference, whatever you want to do. But we can actually get a few of these stings to stack, okay? Now there are 2 things that if we, let's say you have 2 spears in a group, right? We can actually stack our Rend while above 50%, and we can stack this Skewer Bleed. So here's a really good example, right? Where you would take Deep Wound if you're a second spear, and then you would only run 1 point in Perforate. Now when you run all the points in Perforate, it gives it a different Rend stack, right? So we can see here that Rend is increased to 10% per strike against targets above 50% health. Well, this means if you're rocking this point, you will be doing 30% Rend to targets above 50% health, right? But if you use Perforate with nothing in it, like I have right now, the Rend that you applied will be considered a separate debuff category. And what this means is that the first spear that has this passive would apply 30% total Rend, 10% per strike, and the other spear would apply a separate Rend of 5% per strike, meaning that both spears combined are going to be applying 45% Rend total. Now, if you take Deep Wound, you'll also have a separate bleed stack. This means that the other spear that is not taking Deep Wound will apply a bleed via Skewer, and when you take Deep Wound, you will also apply a bleed via your own Skewer. So, right, this is really good to notice, because let's say you're a spear player going into a raid, and you're like, okay, I see this guy's spear. I'm going to ask him, right? Are you taking all the points in perforate? Are you taking deep wound and skewer? And then you can adjust your skill tree accordingly. And I'm going to add that skill tree right here. All right, we're moving on. All right, we're moving on to meta build number 2. And that is going to be Void Gauntlet. So why is Void Gauntlet powerful? Well, if we check out our debuff charts right here, we can see that Void Gauntlet gives us a ton of utility. For one, it gives the entire group 15% empower. It also has 15% weaken via Withering Oblivion, and it also does 30% rend. So a Void Blade is going to be one of the other meta builds that every single comp should require. And again, I'm bringing this up because if you guys are running Hive, right, and you don't see anybody using Void Gauntlet aggressively, then that's something that you guys should be doing, right? This is a build that is mandatory for every group to succeed. Now, a lot of groups will have this on a healer, okay? And this is just because of the way Void Gauntlet scales with focus and int. However, if you are getting a healer or you're with a newer group and they would like to do something different or just focus on heals, it is totally fine if you want to run as a second healer and prioritize using Void Gauntlet more aggressively. So we're kind of going to go over some Void Gauntlet basics right now. I didn't realize that with the spear, I did all the stat stuff at the end, but let's start with the stats right now. Actually, let's go into the attributes. Screw it. All right, so again, health, enchanted word, refreshing, right? Number 1 perks. Just going to show you guys what I rock here. Voracious Blade is really important. Anytime you get weak, you will almost instantly heal to full with Voracious Blade. It's not mandatory, to be quite honest with you. However, I definitely think it's very, very good to run. We got our Attuned Leather Pants, of course. This is probably the best artifact for healers right now. And then, while not mandatory, I decided to use Keen Beacon, because a lot of these bosses, specifically in this dungeon, are backless, or it's very hard to hit their back hitbox. This means that if you can give your group a little bit of extra crit chance, that's going to be really dang good. All right, for weapons, if you're running Life Staff, okay, you're going to be using a Blessed Refreshing Move, Fortifying Sacred Ground Life Staff. Pretty standard. For Void Gauntlet, for newer players on Void Gauntlet, and potentially even what the meta will become because of how important Oblivion uptime is, I think that Refreshing Move right now is really, really good. And it'll be very good for anybody that's new to the game, so that you can improve all of your uptime with abilities, right? So Keen is really good because you get built-in cooldown reduction every time you crit, Vicious to increase your crit damage, and then Refreshing Move to increase your Oblivion uptime. So again, I think while there are better Void Gauntlets for raw damage for more experienced healers, this is a Void Gauntlet that I would recommend for new people getting into the scene. For your amulet, you're just going to be rocking health, empowered, and protection. Any protection that will be most useful to you in your case. Now the ring, you're going to want 2 perks always on the ring, and those perks are going to be Hardy and Sacred. The third perk can be a little bit preference, but I do think that Keen Awareness in the current meta is the best perk for a Void Gauntlet user. And the reason that I say that is because if you stack more Keen, you will do more crit, and every time you crit, you'll get more CDR. So eventually, as you become more experienced, you could actually move away from a Refreshing Move Void Gauntlet, and you could rock something like Attunement or Disdained Infliction, or getting off Refreshing Move, basically just for more damage perks is all. Final perk, we got Empowering Toast. You could also use Fortifying Toast with Healer if you'd like. But yeah, it's kind of up to you. So let's go into the stats. So here is the baseline stats that I would recommend for a Void Gauntlet healer. So this is going to be your minimum. And as you can see in the left-hand corner, I actually have 74 stats available to use. So I got a lot of options. Now, the reason that I start with this, and we'll just go over everything, with the Attuned Leather Pants, 5% light attack damage, this applies to your Void Blade. Dex, extra crit chance, applies to your Void Blade. 200 int is always going to be mandatory if you're Void Blading, simply because of the plus 10% mana gain when every time that you crit. If you don't take this, it will be really hard to like keep your Oblivion and Voidblade uptime because you will be forced to mana pot basically. And using this 200 int buff will basically give you a ton of uptime on your mana, so you basically don't really have to worry about mana management in any way. Reason I got 300 focus here is because I think for newer healers in raids, right? Again, Void Gauntlet isn't used for its raw damage numbers. It's used for its utility. So the weaken, rend, and empower for your group, right? So if you're a healer, right, and especially if you're just starting out and you're new, I think 300 focus is a very good threshold to hit. Normally, if you go below this, you'll start to notice it. But once you get above 300 focus, it's not really noticeable that your heals will make an actual difference. All right? So that's why I'm saying these are the baselines that you can do, right? So I think from here, it's really up to the user to decide what they're comfortable with in running. If you think that you can run less con, then you can just spec all these points into int. If you think that you need to do more healing for your team, you can go up to 350 focus. If you're not comfortable healing yet because you'll draw a lot of normal aggro in the regular parts, you can go up to 100 con. Remember that healers are incredibly important for your group. You need to keep people alive. You need to be healthy enough to do Voidblade and Oblivion. You have a lot of responsibilities. So if you need to hit this 100 con threshold to start with, that's fine. Eventually, I do think you should be working down to 50. And if you just want to do more damage, you can go all the way up to 275. The only other comment I would make here is that 300 int is a pretty big damage gain if you're a Voidblader. So if you actually get into more experienced groups, or you're willing to drop con a little bit, if you can, or maybe a little bit of focus, hitting 300 int will be pretty important for you to min-max your own DPS. However, again, as I just said, this is not mandatory at this time. So let's go over weapon masteries. Now, I'm not going to touch too much on this because I think there are a lot of other healing guides out there that are really good, but this is kind of your standard AoE healer setup. And the reason why this pairs so well with Voidblade is because I don't have to think. I don't have any targets, right? I simply drop my AoE heals on the group, and now I am able to Voidblade. So normally on the VG player, you don't really want a lot of single target heals. However, this is kind of for you to figure out. And there's a ton of other guides. I know my buddy Wowzers made a guide. I think Bebop made a guide as well, but I'll try and link some other guides that I see that I think are good. I'd rather stick on the Void Gauntlet for now just because of how impactful and important this build is. And here's kind of this standard setup that you're going to run. So outside of all the utility we mentioned earlier, you also have an ability called Essence Rupture, which is amazing. I cannot get over how good Essence Rupture is. If we read it real quick, right? We'll just kind of skip down to the actual utility of it. If you do damage while Essence Rupture is up, everybody that hits that boss will get healing. 20% healing for all the damage that they do to a boss that is inflicted by Essence Rupture. This allows your group to simply get healing by doing damage. It's insane. The next like amazing part about Rupture is you also have Invigorating Rupture. And this means that you get stamina back when hitting the target that's affected by Rupture, right? And this is really important because let's say there's actual mechanics and it's like, oh, I need to dodge, right? I need to dodge. Well, if I have Rupture up, if I dodge and then attack, I'm getting stam back, right? And you won't see it here because of how dummies work and how they change them, but you know, you would see it in a normal situation. Okay, so the next thing is, this is your standard tree, right? There also is a 4-perk tree, which I will put up right now. But for the most part, for bosses, this is pretty much what you're going to run. And again, right, because you are so important, it's very important that you keep your Oblivion uptime. So if you can have as much Oblivion uptime as possible, you are going to be giving your group a ton of extra utility. Just like that, baby. So now we're moving on to meta build number 3. And if you've stuck around for this long, you'll know that we talked about Rend in the beginning. And you guys might have seen that, hey, we need 140% Rend to make sure we're doing as much damage as possible on the bosses, right? Well, have no fear. I have the solution. This right here is something that we have seen in Worm, and I will not take credit for it, but there are a few people that have cooked it up before. But it's essentially what we're going to call a Rend Bot build. Now, this is a Hammer Sin build. You do not need Sin, but if we read Sin, debuffs last 20% longer. Obviously, really good. If our entire build is centered around Rend, we want that Rend to last as long as it possibly can. So, here we go. Right now on screen, I'm going to have all of the Rend and Weaken that this build does so that you guys can check it out. So we'll go over everything one at a time, but as we can see, hold on, let me get it real quick. Our hammer does Armor Breaker for 30% Rend. Sundering Clear Out on weapon gives us 24% Rend. Sundering Shock 10%. Trenchant Rend on hammer 16%. And Rending Throw of 20%. Now, the ones I have in green are ones that I believe have 100% uptime. And the ones in yellow are going to be almost 100% uptime with Sin, but probably not 100%. It'll be really close. But as you guys can see, this build does 100% Rend. And the reason why you want a build like this in your group is because if you can focus all of the Rend on one build, that means that everyone else can focus solely on min-maxing their own DPS, which is really important. Essentially, it means in the long term, you're going to slot more Rapiers, right? Now, the Warhammer Sin combo also does some Weaken, which isn't a lot, but it helps us hit that Weaken cap. I'll throw that Weaken up on screen here for you guys now. This will just be two abilities, our Shockwave and Infected Throw, 10%. So now we'll showcase the build and what it does exactly. For armor, right? Again, we got all of our Enchanted Ward, all that good stuff. Now you're going to want Sundering Shockwave on armor for that 10% Rend. We're just rocking a Toon Leather Pants. The big thing here is on hammer. If you can get a Trenchant Rend and Sundering Clear Out hammer, the third perk is irrelevant. These are the main 2 perks you're going to want for this type of build. Now Sin, doesn't really matter what you have on it. As long as you have Corruption, you're good to go. You can rock Keen Awareness, Empowering Toast, and then we just have an Empowered Hammy. We'll go over the skill tree super quick. But as you can see, we're taking Shockwave. We got Clear Out. Actually, I'm not sure. I guess, yeah, this is the Armor Breaker tree. So this is just pure DPS that you would use for bosses, basically. And then you can take Hammer Time for even more uptime on your heavy attacks. Now, I did actually use this for PvP. So I will show you guys a build that I would do. Actually, I'll just include this build on the screen so that you guys can see it. All right, easy peasy. The big ones are Infected Throw and Rending Throw. Those are the 2 you're going to want to take. So now for ability combos, right? As we can see with Trenchant Rend, this means we're going to heavy attack. Basically, the build is as simple as just heavy attacking and weaving in your abilities. So all you're going to do is this. Just like that, I've pretty much applied a ton of Rend. And now we're just going to keep on heavying. So while in practice it seems a little bit silly, this actually allows you to do a ton of Rend and a little bit of Weaken, so that everyone else in your team can maximize their damage. Let's go. I don't think there's anything else to this build. Let's showcase attributes real quick. Because you're going to be mainly heavy attacking with Warhammer, I think you just go something like this. 500 strength, you got your 50 dex, your 50 intelligence, 25 focus, and then the rest you can put in con. Now, the big thing to point out here is that you don't need this build in your comp. While I think it's optimal and it will allow the group to run faster overall, the big thing to notice here is where we're getting the main source of our Rend. So again, if I just include a Warhammer I'll put it up here on screen real quick, right? You guys can see that Warhammer alone can do up to 80% rend by itself. That's 80% of the 140% rend that you need. So point being, right, is that let's say you're going into a raid group and you're like, okay, I don't see that anyone's on Warhammer for this boss. And maybe you're rocking like, you know, a hatchet build, a spear build, a greatsword build, whatever you're using. You know, you should say to yourself, okay, if I don't see anyone on hammer, I'm going to use hammer so that I can apply more rend and then everyone on the team can do more damage. And again, right, these are the things that I want you guys to be thinking about. So this is kind of a fun build. Again, not the highest DPS, but it does apply an insane amount of rend so that you guys can do as much damage as possible to those dang bosses. So the 3 meta builds that were just shown basically do everything you need in terms of rend, weaken, and empower. Now, there are going to be a few other add-ons, little things that we're going to get in between the 3 meta builds that I just showed. And if you want to kind of get to the rest of the utility and how it affects the team comp, you can just skip past this Rapier section for now. But I kind of want to stay on the builds for just a second. So again, if you want to see all the utility, all the numbers, how everything works with rend, weaken, and power, skip forward to the next section. If you want to stay to see Rapier DPS, well, here you go. All right, so as I just said, we've kind of min-maxed all the utility we need with rend, empower, and weaken. So now what we can do is essentially focus solely on DPS. Now, when we talk about DPS, damage per second, there's always only going to be one answer, and that is Rapier. Rapier by far is the highest damage per second in this game. Now, it's important in raid groups, as we already mentioned, to fulfill all of that utility before you start focusing on simply damage. Now, that being said, this guide right here, or this section, will just be kind of focusing on Rapier and how we can min-max Rapier damage. So I'm going to go over 2 different builds, and then we are going to go over skill tree, as well as the 2 different Rapier meta builds that are in play right now. Now, the first one we're going to talk about is Evade Rapier, all right? And just so that you guys see like what the actual combo looks like, if we're just evade onlying, have a lot of damage interactions per second, which is really cool. Also, probably at this point, I'm going to start including some actual gameplay from myself of what it looks like to play an Evade Rapier, so you guys can go ahead and check that out. In the meantime, I will show you guys some builds. So ignore all the gem and resistances and stuff right now. There are 2 things to note when we decide what Rapier build and setup we're going to use, right? For right now, there might be better Rapiers further down the road, but what I would do is I would get Finisher and, excuse me, upgrade it with Disdained Infliction. For the foreseeable future, this is basically going to be your best in slot Rapier. Now, there's 2 things that you're really going to want on your Rapier build, right? Number 1 is going to be Leeching Flurry. Leeching Flurry basically heals you to full anytime you use it. This is an example of what your flurry looks like, right? Awesome. The other thing is omnidirectional evade. And again, if you missed it before in the empower section, I'm going to bring up why you need omni evade. And essentially it's because it gets you empower capped. As we can see, put it up on the screen right here. Awesome. So besides that, we're just going to be rocking max refreshing. We have nimble coat, which in my opinion, and I strongly believe, is the best in slot artifact for any Rapier build. Let me just have health enchanted ward and a conditioning. Empowered on your amulet is very, very important for Rapier. All of the other builds, empowered is kind of like, you could rock it, it's not that big of a deal, you should rock it, but whatever. But for Rapier, I cannot stress this enough, empowered is mandatory. It will increase your length of omnidirectional evade empower length so that you have more uptime. It'll increase empowering toast, and it'll also increase your firestorm. Rapier is all about min-maxing damage, so you want to do as much as you can to min-max as much as possible. All right. So that being said, let's get into the Evade Rapier skill tree. This is basically what you'll be running. Pretty simple. And again, I'll have some playstyle of how you should be playing Evade. You guys can also just check out the 2259 or 2559, whatever the Hive of Gorgons run reposted where I was a flex DPS. I pretty much evade the whole run. So yeah, as I mentioned, right, pretty simple. You're just going to be evade spamming with auto attacks. And then basically when you have flurry up, you can just use it. Very simple. And by doing this, you have basically zero utility, but you have some of the highest DPS in the game. Now, take a note on these bleed stacks that my flurry is applying. We're going to come back to those, all right, when we start talking about the next meta build. Now, on a side note, right, I recognize, and we're going to take a second for these bleeds to go away, but I recognize that a lot of you guys do not have Nimble Coat, especially if you're on Fresh Start, and it will probably take you a while to get it. Now, in my opinion, Nimble Coat is always what you should use, no matter what. I've heard some people being like, oh, Attuned Leather Pants are better because they could make you do more damage, right? I strongly oppose this. There is so much uptime that you can have with your momentum, evade spam, your flurry uptime, and these things allow you to play a lot more aggressively and do more damage over time, even though your raw damage numbers might not be as high. That being said, not everyone has Attuned Leather Pants. Or sorry, not everyone has Nimble Coat. And a lot of you guys have early and easy access to Attuned Leather Pants. So let's go ahead and put a build together with Attuned Leather Pants right now. It is essentially the exact same. You will just put everything else into intelligence. You're still going to want to rock your Omni Evade, your Leeching Flurry, and then you're going to want to rock one medium piece, and I have a fun little hoplite hat here, which I got. And then besides that, right, everything else is the same. So again, right, we're just evade spamming. Easy peasy. So that is your evade build. You know, very simple. One of the biggest things to note is you'll see I'm rocking Empowering Toast. And I'm going to bring up a little bit more information here so that you guys can see the Empower spreadsheet again, right? Specifically for Rapier. Now, I have an important asterisk near Rapier right here, okay? And you guys are going to want to take note of this. So your flurry bleeds, for whatever reason, even though thrust damage counts as Empower, thrust damage on your ring does not actually increase the bleed that is applied from flurry. This means that while you'll have 50.1% Empower on everything else, specifically your flurry bleed will be 50.1 minus ring damage, which will sit around 43%, right? Additionally, unless you hit all your milestones and you get every single checklist with Empowered on Rapier, you will not be Empower capped, right? So what does this mean? Basically, if you are ever in between fights, right? So like, let's say the boss just spawned and we're running into a fight, yeah? Well, proc Empowering Toast, and as you can see, I just got 11 seconds of 10% Empower. Now, one thing you should never do is you should never back out of a fight to proc Empowering Toast. But one thing you can do is basically just in between moments where there's the boss is doing something or there's phases like Typhon, for example. At the beginning of every Typhon phase, just pop your Empowering Toast and then get in there. Easy money. Okay, so we have covered the evade guide, right? And this is going to be your highest DPS. I'm going to have some other guides that other people I trust have made, and I'm going to put that in the description below. Again, go check it out if you get the chance. Now, again, right, remember how I told you guys to take note of those flurry bleeds? Well, I'm going to show you the other meta build that every group should run. And this build is going to be basically exactly the same as what we have seen, with one major change. And that's going to be that we are going to be using FNF. All right? And this is your standard FNF build that you should be using, okay? There is a little bit of a debate right now on whether or not you want to take Unerring, because you don't really have a lot of options for perks and passives to drop. And what I mean by that is that you're going to want all the cooldown reduction you can get, meaning that you only have 3 passives that you have to choose from, right? Or sorry, 4, and you can only choose 3 of them. That is Perfectionist, In Guard, Refreshing Strikes, and Unerring. And as I said, actually, we always want CDR over everything, right? So that means you have to choose between Unerring, In Guard, and Perfectionist. Right now, my gut is telling me that we drop Unerring, because In Guard and Perfectionist are both higher than this. All right. So the key thing here, right, is that we are. Oh, what's going on? Putum will be in the video now. So the key thing is that what we are doing is we are rocking an FNF. And just as I told you to remember about those flurry bleeds, this is really important because flurry bleeds upon rapiers stack. All right. So what this means is that when I flurry, I apply a bleed. And when I FNF, we can't really see it here, but unfortunately the bleed goes away, as you can see. So that means the bleed that I just applied is popped. And FNF bleed pops do incredibly high damage. So if I show you guys, and we are going to touch on this in a little bit, right? But here is basically a comp that we run as a group right now, okay? And what you can see is that we run 5 rapiers, essentially. And because we're running 5 rapiers, each one of these rapiers, every time they flurry, their flurry will apply a bleed. So because we have all these rapiers, right, you just want one person on FNF, and this person's combo will really be like this. FNF. So they'll flurry, FNF. And they can basically spam FNF because you can pop the bleeds once they get to 3 stacks. There are 3 possible bleed stacks, but those bleeds can be applied by any rapier. So if you have 5 different rapiers constantly applying flurry, this means that those bleeds are going to cap out at 3 very, very quickly. And while you won't actually see the damage on your screen when you pop them, like let's say that Putum is over here, right? And he's using rapier to apply flurry, or he's using rapier to apply bleeds, sorry, via flurry. If I pop his bleeds with FNF like this, the flurry bleed will pop on his screen and it will be big, big damage. So that is kind of the meta and how the rapiers are synchronizing right now. And again, right, the builds are incredibly similar. The only main difference is that you are going to want to take your bloody end on the left side, and then all the other rapiers are going to be more of an evade rapier instead of a blood rapier. But for the most part, this is kind of the comp. And this is the DPS that you guys should be focusing on once you guys have covered all the bases with your utility. All right, so at this point, I bet you guys are like, Schmeck, you told me about all of these numbers and information. When are we gonna actually tie all of these things together? And we're gonna do that right now. So let's go over to our rend and weaken sources. So we talked about earlier, right? And this is gonna be a recap of everything, and then we're also gonna go over the comp that I would suggest running for highest DPS. So as we went over it, rend, normal rend cap with rend resilience. This means that there is a rend limit of 140% of cap on this boss. Same thing with weaken and 150% weaken cap, right? What rend does is it reduces the target's armor so that we can do more damage. And what weaken does is it makes the bosses do less damage so that we can go lower con and play more aggressively. All right. So let's look at our comp for a second, right? So here's what we're doing. Now, I told you guys about the Warhammer build with Hatchet. I told you guys about Spear, and I told you guys about the Healer. All right. So these things alone do 100% plus 30% plus 30%, 160% rend. Amazing. If I remember correctly, 160% rend is basically over rend cap, which is awesome. That means with these people doing their jobs, the boss will be fully rended and you guys can do as much damage as possible. Awesome. Now, I'm going to talk about this later because I'm going to do a whole nother build guide on it. But let's talk about Sword and Shield for a second. So with your Sword and Shield player, right? On the 3rd light attack, they do Rend. And let's just go check that out real quick. Sword wear. Here it is. So that's this one right here, your Achilles heel. So as you can see, I have this kind of up as a conditional Rend because I think it will not have 100% uptime basically. It's just a little bit of a bonus. Now, if you rock a Sword and Shield DPS, you will definitely have 100% uptime on your Whirling Blade Rend of 15% for 10 seconds right there. Amazing. So let's go back to the basics. So if you guys do this, you will be able to apply the maximum amount of Rend and do the most amount of damage. If you guys got questions on this, just let me know. Now let's talk about weakens. So again, what is the king meta build? It is our spear. Our spear does 30% Rend, but it also does 78% weaken, which is amazing. If our weaken cap is 150%, which we already figured out, that means we're doing 78% of our 150% weaken off of 2 abilities and 1 build, which is amazing. Now, our Sin Warhammer build is also going to have pretty much 100% uptime, and our healer via Withering Oblivion, hitting mobs while they are inside of their Oblivion, are going to give us an additional 15%. So if we do the math real quick, right? 78 plus 20 is 98, plus 5 is 103, plus 10 is 113. We pretty much have 100% uptime on 113% out of 150% weakened. Now, there's a few other things we can do, and the rest of these is going to come from our tank, right? So now it's like, okay, we're missing about 37% weaken, right? Can we cap this out? And this is where the tank comes in. The tank can use Shield Rush for 20%. They can use Whirling Blade with a Tower Shield and Heavy Armor. You will now do 16% weaken instead of Rend with Whirling Blade. And then you can rock the new Power Stone Artifact Flail for an additional 20%. And I'll show you guys all that right here. So here with our Whirling Blade, we can see if you're in Heavy Armor, you will do 16% weaken instead of doing Rend like you used to. Shield Rush, which almost has 100% uptime, will give you an additional 20% weaken for 10 seconds. And then of course, there's this cool new artifact in the game called the Power Stone Flail. Oh, there it is. And if we read Heavy Burden here, if health is above 90%, attacks cause 20% weaken for 5 seconds. So you'll probably be above 90% HP for quite a long time as you're a tanker. And basically these things together will give you a minimum expected weaken of 153%. And if you throw Whirling Blade in there, you'll even up it to 169%. So now with these things that I've just gone over, you can easily hit Rend cap and weaken cap. And again, Rend allows you to do more damage, and weaken allows you to take less damage, meaning that you can play more aggressively. All right. Now I'm going to share this spreadsheet with you guys so that you can see it. Okay. And I'm going to show a lot of the information that I have here with kind of some standard builds that you guys should be running. Now, we've gone over the Rapier build, right? For blood and evade. I've taken care of that with you guys. We've gone over the healer build, which will run a Life Staff Void Gauntlet. We've gone over the Rend Bot build, and we have gone over the spear build. The only builds I'm not going to take over because it seems like a lot of the questions, and I want the point of this video to be about min-maxing damage, is, we're just not going to talk about the tank today, okay? Now, we talked about leadership, right? So I'll scroll over here to the right. And we talked about leadership being in this 10% empower equation, right? And this is one of the reasons why I go back real quick, is that I really think a Sword and Shield DPS is basically going to be considered meta. And remember how I told you guys that leadership only applies to the people in your group? Well, if we don't have leadership, all 4 of these players are not going to be empower capped, basically. they're going to be missing 9.9% Empower. And what a Sword and Shield DPS does is it allows all of these players to stay Empower capped. And there is some other tech, but you know, I'm not going to talk about all that right now. So anyways, this is kind of the overall comp that we have come up with, or I have came up with, for min-maxing actual damage. And again, right, you can see the rend here. I have constant rend, and then I have potential rend of each build. I also have potential weaken, and these things are totaled down here. Attribute points, what armor artifact you should use, and then just some additional notes. All right. So I'll link this, right? You guys will have access to this. And yeah. So again, right, if we want to talk about our Empower real quick, which we've already covered, we have that constant Empower. And Empower, we already talked about Rend and Weaken, right? At the end of this little wrap up here. And Empower is the last part of the equation that will allow us to do as much damage as possible. And we already talked about all this, right? So I'm not going to go over it too much. But again, you can kind of see how you need to be Empower capped to do as much damage as you possibly can. All right. If you guys have questions, you know, feel free to just let me know. So I think this kind of covers the overall comp. I guess if I wanted to talk about it just real quick, right? Just my final thoughts. So as tank, right? If you are on Sword and Shield, you will give your group leadership. You will have Power Stone to do a little bit more weaken. You will have your Spear player for Rend and Weaken. You will have your Rapier just for raw damage. You will have your Rend Bot to apply the most amount of Rend possible, right? Which we talked about right here. All of this stuff to do as much damage. So this allows the rest of the group to do more damage. You got your healer with the Void Gauntlet going absolutely crazy. And then we have our Sword and Shield DPS with Butcher. This does a few things. If I leak it real quick, you know, it extends debuff duration. It applies more Rend to keep us 100% Rend capped. And it gives all the Rapiers extra leadership so that they're Empower capped, basically. And then besides that, we just run Rapiers. We've done our utility. Now we run Rapier to min-max the rest of our damage, right? So I am going to have one more section after this. We're going to do final thoughts and kind of wrap up of overall comp. And then we'll be done. So I'll see you guys in the next section. All right, let's get into our final thoughts section. So main reason that I wanted to make this video today is because I noticed that just a lot of people, like in Twitch chat, or more specifically in, you know, even YouTube comments, are always asking what is the best build to do the most damage with, right? And I kind of just wanted to bring awareness to the fact that it's not just about the build you use, right? It's about the team composition and what you're doing as a group to truly min-max your damage. So we've kind of covered that today by going over our meta builds like Spear, Rend Bot, and our Void Gauntlet. And those builds are just incredibly important for any group to succeed, right? So the main takeaway is that I really want you guys thinking this, right? What I'm about to say next is that every single time you go into a group and you decide that you want to pug, right? Or you're playing with people you don't know. Basically, there are three things that you should be looking for. And the absolute first one is, does your group have a spear, right? And if they do have a spear, do you think that player is good, right? Do you think that they will understand what their job is, and will they keep things weakened and rended, you know? But the big thing is weakened, right? So this is very important, right? And if you don't think this, or your group doesn't have a spear, then you should use one. All right. Now, the next thing, of course, is Void Gauntlet. It's the same concept, right, guys? And it's the same concept with Warhammer. These types of things are things that, especially in Hive Gorgons, you should be looking for, right? If your group doesn't have a Warhammer for the final, or for the bosses, then you should use one to apply Rend. If you guys don't have someone on Void Gauntlet blading and dropping Oblivion for your group, then that's something that you should build for, okay? And the main takeaway is that these are things I really want you guys to recognize. And by understanding that these builds are so important to the entire group so that the entire, raid can do more damage, I think that you'll gain a better understanding of how to do damage and where that comes from. it's very obvious, you know, that we see, especially on the comp that I have, we just see a lot of rapiers, right? And the only reason we're able to do that is because we can trust the players to do utility that we have assigned to those roles. But if you don't have that utility taken care of, then you should not be running Rapier. You should be prioritizing utility first. All right. Now, with that being said, when you run with these groups, right, there are a handful of other things to note. And the first one is that A, I think there's a lack of understanding of where true DPS comes from. And B, I want you guys to understand that if you do the, like in pugs, right, you guys see a lot of people ranging. There's a lot of ranged people, and that's not the meta of New World. Just kind of as we went over today, it's very obvious to see that the meta for New World is to clump, right? Especially in our runs, right? Like you don't see us doing range damage. And that's because when you're ranged, you're not in heals, you're not in Oblivion, and you're not getting all the benefits that the group does, and you're doing absolutely zero utility. If you are fire staff or bow or musket, you're basically doing no utility for the group, so you're not helping out anybody else. And on top of that, you're just not doing good damage. So the most important thing that I can stress is if like New World is something that you want to stay with, if you want to try and get good with your mates, or you just kind of want to push people and the pug scene a little bit, if you can just learn and force yourself to try and figure out the game from a melee perspective, that is the best way to improve. One of the reasons why it's always been hard for me to accept ranged players or even think about ranged as a meta is because A, it's objectively bad, but B, you don't learn anything. Because if you're ranged, you're kind of going to be going higher con. You're not up in the boss's face learning mechanics, so you're not actually getting better at the game. And at that same time, you're not doing anything to help your group. And I think that these things should be thought of more when you play New World. Now, of course, if you want to be casual, that's completely fine. But if you're someone that wants to take a more serious approach, get better at the game, and then go faster while you're doing it so that you guys can actually succeed in your runs, then a lot of the stuff that I'll be talking about is important, right? So I know I mentioned, you know, that a lot of us are running 5 con. I even mentioned in the build videos that I would suggest that you can run 50 con. But if you're not comfortable doing that, I would much rather have someone be 50 con, 100 con, medium armor even, up in the boss's face learning mechanics, rather than just being someone that sits in the back and doesn't actually learn how to get better in each fight. So if you want more of that cushion of being medium armor or being more con so that you can learn mechanics, you know, eventually that's going to pay off for you down the road. And because you'll be in your group's heals, you will be in Oblivion, if you have that, of course, and because you will be closer to the group, you will be able to utilize all the utility your group does, and you can do more uptime on actual damage, because ranged in this game is just very, very low damage as a main hand specifically. So those are my final thoughts. I know we covered a lot today. I hope that if you guys have questions, you ask me, please, please, please. Again, you can check out my Twitch, which I'll have linked in the description. And also I'm going to have a bunch of other like just people that have played the game and done runs or done build suggestions, or even other guides that I truly like respect and I like what they're saying. I'm going to have all of that information in the description below. So please feel free to check everything out. If you guys watch the whole freaking video, thank you. And I hope that everybody improves in the realm of PvE. So once again, guys, this is Schmeck. I appreciate you guys all watching. I'm taking off now, and I'll see you in the next one.